Yeah, Portside.
Portside is the operator of the Mary Whaler, currently berthed to 11. They're a non-profit web-based organization that has been providing maritime education, workforce training, working waterfront advocacy, and other programming at BMT for almost 20 years. Their proposal included expansion of the current programming, serving workboats and blue highway flyers. And they also want to include 20,000 square feet of interior upland space in a building at Pier 11, which would include exhibit space, office space, a welcome center, and flexible programming space. They also want to build a wet lab, and they want to rebuild Portside Park alongside the berthing space and an outdoor nature center. Portside is interested in the remaining berth at Pier 11 in the United States. The next category includes two firms who are active cruise terminal operators who are only interested in operating the BCT section of the property. First up, we have Cruise Terminal International, or CTI. They were formed in 2023 and are owned by Icon and the Royal Caribbean. They are an independent global designer, developer, and operator of cruise terminals worldwide. CTI owns Miami Cruise Terminal A, which handles over 2.1 million passengers annually, as well as projects in Ravenna, Italy, which is under construction and planned to open in 2026, in Barcelona, which is currently under construction, and St. Thomas and Fiumicino, Italy, which are both in planning stages. CTI's proposal validates many of the assumptions made in the vision plan, including the general size of the cruise terminal building, the size of the ships that could be attracted, and the importance of building attractive public space around the cruise terminal building. They're also committed to providing state-of-the-art shore power facilities, as can be seen in the project before as well. GPH, or Global Ports Holding, is a cruise port developer and operator that has been in operation since 2004. They manage 32 cruise ports across 19 countries, including Nassau in the Bahamas, Barcelona, Singapore, Lisbon, and San Juan. Combined, their terminals will welcome over 22 million passengers in 2026. GPH's proposal is supportive of the vision plan for cruise operations at Pier 12, and also emphasize the importance of implementing state-of-the-art shore power development at their facilities. The remaining respondents were mostly focused on providing services to port operators at BMTDC, or BMTDC. In general, these respondents fell into three categories. Some, like Aris and Crowley, were offering consulting services for structuring public-private partnerships. Others, like Arup, Persic and Warfield, SST, and Transnet, were design firms who were interested in providing design services relating to certain aspects of the project. And finally, some were offering services to the eventual port operator, and these services included towing, electric vehicles charging infrastructure, or autonomous pallet scale robotics. Next up, we're going to talk about next steps now that the RFEI has been responded to and we've done this. Before we move to the next steps, I want to take a moment to explain how port RFEI responses relate to the environmental review. Since that's a question we've heard frequently. Under the State Environmental Review Act, the Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, is required to include an alternatives analysis. The purpose of this analysis is to look at reasonable and feasible options that either avoid or reduce significant environmental impacts, or that approach the project in a different way while still meeting the project's core goals and objectives. This analysis requires an apples-to-apples comparison of alternate scenarios in the proposed project, so decision makers can clearly understand the trade-offs between different scenarios. Under state law, the EIS will always include at least two alternatives, the proposed alternative and a no-action alternative. The no-action alternative reflects existing conditions and no project will move forward. If the proposed project were to result, if it is found that the proposed project which will result in unmitigated significant adverse impacts, the EIS would also have to include the third analysis, draft scope of work released in September also notes the potential for a report informed by these RFEI responses. The ideas, feedback, and keys raised through the RFEI will help inform whether such an alternative is reasonable and feasible to study. Ultimately, it is the lead agency's decision on which alternatives are reasonable to study. The lead agency in this case is the Mayor's Office of Environmental Coordination. I also want to emphasize that while alternatives are studied in the EIS, there are no requirements that an alternative be selected or implemented at the end of the process. The purpose of the analysis is to inform decision, not to predetermine one. During the next steps, I want to share a reminder that the scoping comment period has been extended to May 8th. This meeting is not a forum to lodge formal comments on the scoping documents. So if you'd like to comment on the draft scope of work or environmental review framework, written comments can be submitted to the Mayor's Office of Environmental Coordination. There's an email address up on the screen right now, and it's in the packet that you can take home with you. Those comments help define what will be studied in the draft guidance. Separately, the BMTDC board will review and discuss the core RFEI responses that have been discussed today at its next board meeting, which we are planning to schedule in the coming months. That discussion will focus on what we learned from respondents, including themes that may be relevant to the environmental review, and future decision making like procurement strategies and lease structure. Importantly, the closure of the public comment period for scoping in May does not restrict our or the BMTDC's ability to carefully review RFEI responses and incorporate new insights through the summer or fall before a draft EIS will be released. Any alternatives identified as a result of the RFEI review, BMTDC deliberations, or deemed necessary prior to the agency judgment will be comprehensively evaluated and presented in the forthcoming draft environmental impact. There will be a dedicated public hearing for each one and comment period for the draft EIS and the general project plan, providing further opportunities for the public to weigh in and for additional feedback to be considered. This process ensures there's sufficient time and flexibility to incorporate the latest findings with RFEI and to appropriately analyze a range of reasonable alternatives. While the EIS may include the core alternative for value and comparative analysis purposes, it is important to emphasize that we continue to advance the Brooklyn Marine Terminal project as outlined in the improved vision plan and as detailed in the draft scope of work. Alternatives within the EIS will ultimately be judged by how closely they fulfill the project's goals and objectives as outlined in the vision plan. Thank you, and now we have some time for Q&A.
So now we're going to go to the stage session Q&A for the evening. If you raise your hand, people can talk loudly, that's right, a little bit easier and not the microphone. And
Maybe if I stand here. Everybody hear me? Does that work? Okay, cool. Hi everyone, I am Randy Gordon. I am president of the Columbia Street Waterfront Association. Got some flyers for our association over there, including something about our Earth Day celebrations, so it's going to be great Saturday. First of all, I do want to note that CSWA has written to EDC twice in relation to the RFEI, once in support of the joint electives letter that Council members Deeds and Aviles and Assembly members Simon and Hayes and Borough President Antonio Reynoso read for asking for an extension, and also asking for these meetings, thank you, and finally asking that the full RFEI responses be shared where feasible. And we wrote a follow-up letter to you last week asking the same. I'm going to ask a series of questions that relate to one of the two RFEI responses that have been made public by the respondents. Port side's one, Prologis is the other. And I'm not doing this, I want to make clear, I'm not doing this because I'm an expert on ports, because I'm not, there are real experts on ports here. And I'm not doing it because in any way I favor a plan or CSWA favors plan, but I think I like to illustrate the value to the community of getting these details. So, first for any question, David, I asked you in the first session. So you had 220 companies evaluating the RFEI opportunity, 25 responded, so 12%. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I know I asked you some of the reasoning, and you said when you looked at it, some of these companies said it wasn't an RFP, they looked at it on time, that's reasonable. Because we've got 6 that are classified support operators, I was wondering if you had any sense of that was 6 out of how many of the 220 made it report operators?
I don't specifically recall. I think most of the port operators, including 20, that I don't know. I will say that of the folks who showed up to the information session,
Right.
most of the people who were port operators who showed up to the vast majority of those who showed up to the info session did wind up submitting the RFI.
Okay. Okay.
Majority 6.
Good. So, again, Prologis shared the results of their full RFEI when they had represented at the first meeting, and he sent around his email, so some of us have requested it. Portside again did so as well. I just have a few comments relating to the Prologis full response. That's negotiating on Portside. I'm very interested too. I know the Prologis response is 27 pages. They work with an architect, only architecture, pictures, like we showed, maps, and yet they put in some legitimate time considering, again, as you said, this is not a guarantee that it will be considered for an RFP. So, now, as we noted, they were the one of the 6 who specifically said that they preferred sort of bigger peers, and there was a question here, and question 9 was how important is a marginal peer with 1,700 linear foot for your business? Could the business operate just as efficiently with restoration of finger peers at peers 8, 9A, and 9B? And I'll just read a bit of their response. And part of the reason I am is I think I got a lot out of this. I'm really curious to read full responses of the other port operators and their argument for the marginal peer. So they said, not important, following discussions with multiple vessel operators and pier design consultants, we determined that the cost of expanding the pier by infilling the spaces between the existing finger piers could not be justified. The area experiences high water flow rates, and the open configuration of the existing finger piers facilitates safer and more efficient vessel maneuvering for new highway operators. We go on from there. They note in their plan that by redoing restoration of the finger piers, they're saying that will save $1 million. And that number stuck with me because I spent a really unhealthy amount of time going through the task force folders that CP6 made available. And thank you, Community Board 6, if you're here. For every meeting, they have all the documents that were presented to the task force. And so, I spent a lot of time there, so I was doing some financial analysis. So, back on January 30th, that's when a lot of the information about the consultants' recommendations around the marginal peer were shared, in the case was made for the marginal peer. There's a BMT financial memo authored by Burl Hampel, who was working with Milton Nickel and other consultants. And it says infrastructure costs. A study of infrastructure investments made at precedent U.S. ports indicates landlords, port owners versus port operators, are responsible for substructure improvements in infrastructure. Scenario 1, which kind of is where we ended up, but it's not quite, includes a new marginal pier for an estimated cost of approximately $1.2 billion, including associated dredging. So that seems to line up with that $1 billion estimate, and my first question is this still accurate? This was from back in January 30th, 2025. I know the total cost of the port, the final vision plan is about $1.7 billion, which was just about half of the $3.5 billion for the entire project. So, just curious about that. And then,
Can I answer that?
Sure.
That's a complicated question.
Okay, sure, yeah.
So, I believe that Prologis' argument that they would save $1 billion by not building the market here is not correct. And the reason I say that is, as you mentioned, the estimate for the cost of the marginal pier is 1.2. That's still a working number for that. But the alternative, which is maintaining the finger pier, piers let us know what it would take to bring these piers to a state of good repair, because I think, as everyone knows, the Port Authority let these piers get into a state of significant deferment, resulting so much so in like 98, 90, 90 effectively closed. What that resulted in was that it would cost about $150 million to bring Pier 9B up into state of repair, another $150 million to bring Pier 9A into state of repair, and then I believe it was another $200 million to bring Pier 8 into state of repair, and then another $200 million to bring Pier 7 into state of repair. So all told, if you just wanted to keep the existing big repair condition, that's about a $700 million price tag, and that's ballpark based on the design, the inspection, not the actual. And so the savings of the margin of not building the marginal pier is not the full cost of the marginal pier, it's the delta between those two, which is closer to 5.
Okay.
If I may, what is the overall dollar value of this entire project, the range?
Yeah. I think you mentioned that.
3.5 billion.
Yeah.
3.5 billion?
3.5 billion.
3.5 billion, and that is basically broken down into the two halves. About half of that is the cost associated with bringing the entire port to a state of repair, and as you mentioned, 1.2 of that is the cost of building the pier. And the other half of that is the cost to bring infrastructure and resiliency and build parks on the other portion of the site, not waterfront. So that's basically how the 3.5 breaks down. It's kind of
So on the financial aspect of it, what is the return on investment? What would this be worth in the future after it's completed?
It's hard to answer that question because it's, we're viewing the port investment as an investment in citywide infrastructure. Because what it's going to wind up doing is it's going to provide a more resilient system for moving commodities throughout the city, which will take traffic off the roads, reduce wear and tear on our highways and bridges, and reduce environmental impacts in neighborhoods that are next to highways. And so we don't really view it as solely a financial impact. On the residential and multi-use site, there's a portion of residential, there's also a lot of avenues going into building new parks. I don't think we really calculate financial return on new parks. I think there are park-based nonprofits that have tried to calculate the financial return. I think in general, people would acknowledge that building new parks is a positive economic return. We're kind of in the middle of a question inside of another question in an inception kind of thing, so I want to kind of get back.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll finish. There's time to come back to one more. But yes, so again, drawing on this point that there's a lot of interesting things in the responses. I know you pointed out the regulatory hurdles that might be faced about what housing on piers, right? And I know the response makes reference to regulatory hurdles of building up marginal pier too. And again, in that same financial memo, and this is something I did notice 3 or 4 or 5 times I read this. Per requirements of New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, expansion of layouts over water necessary to deliver the marginal pier requires partial demolition of existing Pier 7. And I don't remember that coming up at all. So I was just curious, you mentioned that it makes sense there's regulatory hurdles around villages, I get that. But I know other folks have raised the issues regulatory hurdles around the marginal pier itself, so can you speak to that?
Absolutely, and that's a good question. Thank you for raising it. So this came up during a session that we had earlier this week as well. So I appreciate that. It's a question that's bubbling from the community, and I want to make sure that everyone has a full understanding of the issue. So we meet regularly with the state DDC on a number of projects that we see throughout the city, and we met regularly with them during the planning process as we were developing this as well. We showed them this design for the marginal pier. And it is, that demo of Pier 7, that statement taken from the loader's response or from a different?
No, it's from the
So the plan has changed a little bit. At one point in the plan, we were looking to, one of the things that often happens when you're doing a project that involves adding coverage over waters in New York State controlled waters is that the state DEC will sometimes how we mitigate that extra 11 acres, right? Because the recoverage of something that's already covered doesn't need to be researched.
It's really, under the buildings on 8, 9A, 9B, I think all three have buildings on them, but
90
in the center section solid,
is it what?
in the center of the
Yeah, they're completely down to the one that has a sensor section of solid neutral, but 8, 9, and 9 are completely water. So there's 11 acres of additional coverage that happens in this one year. So we brought that up to DEC, and they asked what their response was. We also, in our budget, so in that 3.5 billion, we've included a sum that could be used to pay for whatever mitigation DEC may require. So we brought it up to DEC and we said, hey, this is our plan. It does involve 11 acres. But one of the things that DEC weighs when they're kind of reviewing spending is they are very focused on whether the reason you are doing this is to have a direct maritime related use. So obviously building a margin here for port-related uses is a very, 100% on the bullseye maritime related use. And so they looked upon that very favorably. And what they said was, this proposal, obviously we haven't gone through the full review with them yet, but in this initial preliminary level, they said we could see getting to a place where this would be approved, and we may not even require a significant amount of mitigation to get there because it's so directly in line with what we want to see happen. If you're going to cover this is kind of in line. Similarly, so at one point, sorry, so at one point, before we had that conversation with GDC, we were kind of anticipating that conversation, and we were proposing that one way to mitigate some of that additional coverage on site would be to take Pier 7 and cut it in half and uncover Pier 7. And that was a proposal that we were listed at the early stage of the task force. Many task force respondents, specifically those who were kind of community, as I mentioned, the task force had community responsible elected officials, industry, maritime industrial respondents, and port hospitals. People who were community representatives on that task force really didn't like cutting Pier 7 in half because the proposed use of Pier 7 was small. So cutting Pier 7 in half would provide less park space, and they really liked the idea of using the full Pier 7 as a park. And so through the task force deliberation process, we wound up agreeing that we would not use half of Pier 7 to offset mitigation, and that we would, put a little bit more money in the budget to cover a little bit more mitigation because we weren't going to be able to have mitigation from the demo of Pier 7. And so that's a part of that memo that was in January 25. Right. So that's just a piece of that memo that's out of at this point. The dollar value for the floor is still okay, but that piece is a little out of And so yeah, also during the task force process, there was a moment in time where, if you recall, the site had an inlet that kind of dips in between Pier 7 and Pier 8. And that's a kind of pinch point on the site. And there was a moment in time when we were looking at covering over that inlet. And because that's in the section of the site where there is residential developments, and we're trying to kind of anticipate traffic improvements, where there's going to be as well, it would have alleviated a pinch point if we could take one of the residential development sites and move it onto that deck that we were proposing over the inlet. And we had that conversation with DEC, and I cannot emphasize enough how strong DEC reacted to that and said, effectively, there is no path forward in New York State in which we will never approve the coverage of a piece of water or deck for residential use. It's just not in the system. It doesn't work. So that's what I'm referring to when I talk about the hurdles on the village thing. So I think there's a lot of interesting pieces of the village thing. I think that there's potentially an opportunity for village to rethink some of what they've done, but the portion of the proposal that includes, that's based on bringing residential onto those covers, based on direct conversations we've had with the agency that would be required to regulate it, to approve it, is that it's not.
Can I?
Since the Hunts Point connection seems important to many of the
Or is it 10
No, that's a great
minutes?
question, thank you. So, EDC manages the Hunts Point facility as well. And you may have heard in the past year, there was a long overdue effort that removed the prison barge from the Hunts Point facility. And so that facility has been closed down and brought off site. And the removal of that facility has created I want to say it's 10 or 11 acre site. I don't remember the exact size of that. But there's a site on the water of Hunts Point. It used to be where the BCDC prison barge was. And EDC has put forth a plan to take that site and convert it into a blue highway facility, and has put forth a proposal to the city to fund that construction. And in last year's capital budget, there was, and I forget the exact amounts, but there was a significant several $1 million were dedicated in the city's budget towards that project. And so one of the things that we're looking at, I mentioned that one of the things that these RFEI responses might be useful for is trying to figure out exactly what the eventual port RFP will include. And so one of the things we're toying with is, do we include in the RFP jointly managing this port and that in one facility, or do we, because there's a economy of scale there, or do we kind of have them run by two separate people, two separate RFP processes, and they just would have to work together? So that was why we included that question in this RFEI, because we wanted to get some feedback about the attractiveness of that, and does it add value to the site?
Okay, so one other thing, how would all this additional maritime activity impact the ferry routes? Was this too far down the road? Is this, I mean, are ferry routes that are there going to remain? Are they going to get moved? Or,
It is not our intention to remove those ferry routes. Those ferry routes are very important to us. We manage the ferry system. We are constantly barraged by both community members in the local community who want us to increase the frequency of that ferry service, and as well as people who live in other communities that aren't lucky enough to currently have ferry service who want us to bring ferry service. Our intention, which has been stated openly, is to take the ferry service that exists and to invest in it and to expand it and grow it, not to remove it. So there's plenty of opportunity. The East River is big. There's plenty of space for these small ferry ships and ships as well. And if anything, I should point out that in the mission plan itself, one of the missions that is made, one of the positive things about the additional residential development that was proposed around that basin is that it provides more of a customer base to help justify more frequent ferry service to Redhook. So right now, I think it's a ferry on 45 minutes or so, and I think our goal is to cut that in half. With these additional, 1,000 minutes of that basin, we think we can do that. It makes sense.
Real quick, can I? How much is the Hudson? What do you mean? I mean the Hunts Point pier cost?
I don't know that number off the top of my head.
Because it was a ridiculously low number. It was something like in the papers, like 45 million or something like that.
Yeah, that sounds about right, but it's obviously a much smaller facility, and it's not a big one here, it's a dock.
So, like, if the Flexport is going to be used mostly for the Blue Highway, right, and the ships from here are going to go there, then why do we need this ultra something where the same ships are going to go over there, and it's good enough over there?
That's a good question. So when we look at the Blue Highway network, we really think of it as a network with a series of roads that are located at waterfront locations in each one of the 5 boroughs. And the goal is to move commodities from within the city by barge rather than on the road as the Blue Highway. So that's the moniker. And this BMT would not just be unknown on that system. BMT would be kind of one of the major nodes on that system. And the real opportunity here is BMT is not just a node for things traveling around from borough to borough. But BMT is a site that also includes Pier 10, in which goods and commodities are coming in from other locations in other cities. So that is a point at which commodities are entering the system. So the amount of Blue Highway traffic that would come out of this facility, we anticipate would be significantly higher than the kind of feeder facilities that each one of them would go to. And Hunts Point would be more of a feeder facility. Now, another piece of it is that, as we talked about in this presentation and also in the vision plan, the Blue Highway use is one of only several uses that we anticipate happening at that marginal pier. We also think there's an opportunity for other bulk movement of goods at that pier. There's an opportunity for potential expansion of the container port if the market demands such that the marginal pier would allow for flexibility for container ships to dock there as well, and also the ability to move construction staging materials to large infrastructure projects. So our site is not sized just to be in a relationship with Hunts Point. Our site is sized to serve with all the highway networks, not just one. No, it's not just one. Also to have other uses beyond.
All right, and because when you said that, right, that didn't sound right to me. And so I just Googled real quick, like, in New York, has housing ever been built on piers? And it says, yes, housing has been built on immediately over the water in New York City, most notably Waterside Plaza in Manhattan in the 1970s, which sits on concrete platforms over the East River. While rare other proposals for residential development on piers, such as Pier 40, have been seriously considered. So the point is, like, it's not impossible. It hasn't been done to just write it off. This is what we've been asking for: bold, innovative ideas here. This is Brooklyn. This is the the capital of the world. We should have a waterfront here that the whole world comes to look at and says, "Wow, look at what they did." This plan is nothing like that. It wouldn't even be in the top, whatever of. But how would it be?
The plan you referenced from 1970, I think it was before DEC was operating.
But the point is that it's been done. Is that the DEC or whoever, like, these things have been done and they can be done and they're done all over the world.
The other piece of information is that in direct conversations with DEC, they have explicitly told us they were with that. And the example that you raised in your comment that kind of trailed off on Pier 40 was one where they were anticipating doing housing work, and that didn't happen. It was not their space. The DEC specifically told us that they were not. Well, because they don't think that it is worthwhile, it is environmentally responsible to cover up waterways and create a shade on waterway unless that use is specifically.
Yeah, but this is different. This is different because I can understand if you're just doing residential on it. It's still their plan calls for the bottom to still be work as maritime, right? Warehouses and stuff like that. And then over it residential. I'm not saying that I'm fighting for this plan. I'm just saying that you guys just write it off too quickly without really analyzing these plans. There's a bunch of different plans out here. And we haven't been able, like, we would have liked the whole science fair workshop, right? Right in here. Give everybody a table. Let's all see these different plans. That never happened. And it's a shame.
I appreciate your optimism, but I'm just trying.
No, don't say that. No, stop acting silly. You don't have to appreciate my optimism. It's just that, this waterfront here, we could only do it one time. It has to be right the first time. That's it. And you guys aren't the master of all good ideas. I mean, as much as you would like to think so, there's other good ideas out here, and it would have been nice to see other alternatives. For you to say, right? For you to say, excuse me, I'm talking. For you to say that the nothing happened alternative, whatever you call that's disingenuous, because you guys left $90 million at the Port Authority that was supposed to be fixed. That fixed. So it can't be a plan where it stays the way it is, because it can't stay the way it is. Somebody has to fix that, right? And you took that responsibility on as the EDC. When you gave up the Port Authority, you let them keep that $90 million and traded $100 million, according to Kimball, your ex-boss, at the council hearing. You gave up $100 million pier for one that was worth nothing, he said. So, like.
That $100 million pier now is in good condition. It's because the Port Authority, who has been maintaining that pier for many years, had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in that pier because they found that pier.
And they had the money for this one too.
But they weren't doing it, and they were never doing it.
But when you traded, you should have said, well, you got to fix it at least. Give us that money to fix it.
I will tell you that one of the easiest things to do is to sit on the sidelines of a deal that has been negotiated and said, I would have negotiated a better deal. And I'm not the person who negotiated this deal.
Anybody could have negotiated.
The negotiation happened. There was an attempt to secure revenue from the Port Authority on this deal. They were not willing to do so, even though we pointed, as you just did, to the fact that they had money in their capital budget from a couple years before to do that. That was part of the negotiation. Port Authority made it clear that they were not moving forward in that way. There was a judgment call to be made about whether to move forward without them doing that, and it was ultimately decided that it was the best interest
Bad decision. I'm glad he's no longer head.
Oh yeah, a couple of questions. I think they're pretty rapid fire. One, I think the woman in front of me asked a pretty similar question, but it sounds like you probably would prefer. And I'm kind of tempted to see these kind of RFEI responses presented in order of how much you prefer them. But you kind of started with the ones that would vertically integrate a blue highway system between Hunts Point and this one. Is that sure? How important is it to have a port operator that's vertically integrated, or at least like, yeah, I guess vertically integrated between Hunts Point and BMT?
So that was one of the questions. So one of the questions that, just to flip your question the other way, which is about how important is it, we were asking the question, how much interest is there on the market side to be the integration between them? And do we think, one of the things that we were very focused on throughout this process is, and I mentioned this in the beginning of the presentation, is that the current operations are unsustainable, right? There is hundreds of millions of dollars in deferred capital work that needs to happen, and on an operation basis right now, the current port is losing money. Not for the operator, the operator losing money, but it's for the landlord is losing money. The amount of subsidy to keep that barge going exceeds the rental rate. That is not a knock on Mike Stonatis at the container terminal. He's been doing an amazing job operating with one arm tied behind his back by Port Authority for the last several decades, and kudos to him. What the goal of this project from our perspective from the maritime was to see, is there a way to take this current port, which has hundreds and losing that. One of the reasons that these piers are in such bad shape, even though the Port Authority would constantly put money in their 5-year budget to invest in these piers, they would constantly put that in budget and not spend it. And the reason they wouldn't is because they didn't view this. The Port Authority is like the big port operator, right? The Port of New York, New Jersey is the second largest port in New York, in America, the largest port of the East Coast. It gets 6 million containers traveling through it every year, and the vast majority of the ships that come in there are giant container ships that are coming from China across the Atlantic Ocean. Right? And this pier is not this container port can't handle it, right? So this is asking the port. The analogy I like to give is asking the Port Authority of New York to operate this pier is like asking Costco to operate the Tate, right? Like, yes, it's the same kind of thing, but it's like a completely different scale. And so the Port Authority never really felt that this was an important part of their operations. It wasn't critical. When you narrow that perspective to New York City and to like the movement of goods around New York City, for us in New York City, we think it can play a really important role. And so for us, if we can get to the decision kind of was, if we can get to a place where the port is at least revenue neutral, or making a little bit of money and not requiring operational subsidies too. And the way we get there would be by increasing the throughput through that port, making it a little more active, just having more commodities come through it, which is KFB to the port. Then that would make us feel better about investing the hundreds of millions of dollars in the port, because maintaining waterfronts is expensive. It always is. It always will be. Like the way it actually getting into these ports, every second that goes by is the average rate that we pay for. So you really got to stay on top of it. And we would take on that responsibility to invest in the port infrastructure if we felt that the operations on top kind of justified it too well.
Okay, yeah, that totally leads into like my other question. It's like, how does given this like 60-acre port, how does the delta and like kind of jobs being created by retooling it with like the modern material and all this compared to like just sort of leaving? I guess what's the actual acreage right now on the site that's actually being used for here? Yeah. And what's just kind of like a brownfield? What's the delta of this? And like what kind of sorry? Yeah, brownfield. Like what's just kind of like leftover space is not really being part of the view. And like what would this plan do to like the number of jobs like going forward? And yeah, and just sort of like last question was, do you feel that like given the responses of this RFEI, if you'd asked for an RFEI for like 122 acres, would you have unlocked like way more responses that would have made the port way more viable, or the responses that you got in the RFEI feel pretty right on to make this project economically viable?
Yeah, so those are your questions. Let me start. There are a couple of things in there I want to start with. First of all, on jobs. This is the point that I've made a couple of times. I think normally when we talk about economic development projects, we measure a successful economic development project in terms of the number of jobs. Right? That's not really the way to measure this project because ports, by their definition, are big open spaces where you're moving huge containers. So on a density, person per acre, they don't pencil very well, right? There's currently at Greta, there's about 170 longshoremen who are part of the ILA, the International Longshoremen Association of the Longshoremen Community, who work on site. And what we anticipate is with this investment and this kind of additional traffic going through, that could grow to 200, 250, but still it's not a huge job number. But we think, regardless of that, we think the purpose for this project is not job creation on the site. The purpose for this project, as I mentioned before, is it's an infrastructure project, right? When you invest in a subway line, you don't think about how many people are going to work on the subway train. You think about how it makes the whole city run better. And that's what we think this project does. I think it makes the city run better by allowing us to move commodities through the city in a more effective and efficient way. So that's kind of, so that's what it is. We also asked about the current uses on the site. So as you can see here, so this is Pier 10. This is about half the site. The ships come in and berth over here, and then almost all of this area here is used to stack containers, which is an important part of the site. So this is all very used. You see this area over here with the dotted thing? That is currently a parking lot. It's a parking lot that has two users. One is there's a Tesla repair shop over here, and while the Teslas are coming to repair it, while they're kind of waiting on the thing, they rent out space to Tesla. Tesla parks some of the vehicles there. The other thing is that there's, as part of the EIS for Atlantic Yards, for the Market Center, the trucks that come in and deliver the stage and things like that to the Market Center, you can have like ice containers or whatever kind of coming in, and big new trucks that kind of come in. The Market Center has a loading dock in the basement, so they go down to the basement, they unload, and then those trucks have to live somewhere while the event is going on. This is actually where they park. So while Disney on Ice is happening at the Barclays Center, the trucks that deliver that stage are parked here. That's what I would do. I would not consider that an important piece or anything like that. So that's this piece over here. Over here, as I mentioned, Pier 9 and out of service. So that's each one of those 4.5 acres. So that's 9 acres of space that's currently not being used. Pier 8, this drawing is a little bit out of date. It shows a dock area on the top half of Pier 8. The lower half of Pier 8 is currently used by Customs and Border Patrol. That's where a lot of goods that are coming in from out of the country, and they have need to be inspected by Customs. Many of them from South America, especially want to inspect them. So when crime is coming in here, the Customs and Border Patrol selects certain containers to be inspected, and they're brought up to Pier 8 and they're inspected in this warehouse here. That's the lower 2/3 of that warehouse. The outer courthouse warehouse at the time the Shoutout was made, it actually leased to a company that they rented out plastic cars to movie sets. So there was full of kind of cool plastic cars. They have left, they're not there anymore. And recently that site has been leased short term for the next year or so to Equinor, who, as I mentioned before, is the Norwegian company who's building the offshore wind facility out in the port. So this is temporary use for them for staging, construction staging for that port out there. So that's that temporary use. But now that it's great, it's maritime, but it's only anticipated to last about a year or so, so we'll need more. And then on the off-lease area over here, so this gray cutout is where the old offices were in the Port Authority outside, currently the DC's management office is. And also, this is the family red room, which is where a lot of the task force meetings took place, the big conference room, capital. sanitation work that parks the vehicles when they're not going to commercial sanitation. It's not the city corporate sanitation, it's a private. There was for a while in this area over here, the DOT had leased it out. It was used that many people in the community found offensive, but they were bringing in concrete from construction projects.
We know it well.
Yeah, no, that's the time over here. They're not going to be out since, I believe it was November, not even in October. So that's one of the things happening over here. I mentioned Ionic Water. They're a company that builds scour protection bags, which are basically bags full of rocks. That's the kind of concrete company. And they put those together and they put them on ships and ship them out to a lot of infrastructure sites in the water that require additional weight on the river floor in order to make sure that their structure is sound. So that's happening in this area. Yeah. So a good chunk of this is empty. When I first started, the first year or so that I was working on this project, a good chunk of this area was full of containers. That there was a project that had been proposed in Times Square, I think, to build a hotel out of modular pieces, and that project went bankrupt. And so the bank owned these modular pieces, and they were literally storing it here for a couple of years, just taking up space. They were like fully built out hotel rooms in a container. About a year ago, the bank finally found a buyer for them. I think there's a developer in Philadelphia who decided to try his hand at that. So about a year ago, those things went out. So there's a lot of open parking space in this area that is fairly open as well. So I'm trying to paint a picture, as I mentioned in my presentation. Even though red container terminal's footprint is about 60 acres, and there's the container uses, there's other maritime related uses. So one other thing I can mention over here, in this area over here, is where Tilcon is, who's an aggregate company. They bring in sand and stone and construction aggregate by barge, and it goes out by truck. So they're a subset as well. So there's the 30, 35 acres up here, 10. And then there's the remaining 25-ish acres that probably that's just rough estimate. Half of it is used by outdoor industrial tenants. Half of it is either parking or
Speaking to the subject of the bidder vision, the international container shipping industry has been around since now in the 1960s, 70 years. So projecting supply and demand in any trade is a pretty known science. Was projecting the need for blue highway also given the market for nickel, or did the EDC or any other entity hire a separate consultant who looked specifically at blue highway? The question is really twofold. Was New York State DOT involved at all in the planning? And I guess I'll leave it there.
So the Blue Highway initiative has been an ongoing project between EDC and City DOT for several years. It's been a project that we've been working on with the City DOT to kind of feel smarter about it. It's an idea that we've incorporated over the last decade, really. And we've done a lot of work to kind of means test it. There's been a bunch of pilots that have been done. Many of the folks who I mentioned in the presentation, the U.S. Coastal and Citadel Marine have done some of those pilots for us. There was a pilot that was done a year ago to serve the government maritime concessions, bringing some of the alcohol in. There's also a pilot that was done earlier this year with makeup company up here in Sephora to put in some makeup from the site over to. So there have been a couple of pilots. It's still a concept that we work on. Moffitt and Nichols' study for us was not really focused on the blue highway piece. The blue highway piece is something that actually we've been working on independently with DOT. Their study was mostly focused on answering what we thought was a really important question, which was, is there a way to take this one-inclusive port right now, and if we were able to capture additional market share, would that turn it around? And if it were to capture additional market share, what would that market share look like? Who would it have to attract? What would we have to do to make the site more attractive to capture that additional market share? not another one or two services under the port that will radically transform.
All due respect to the EDC, you have a lot of resources and you hire very good people. There's no question. However, we're talking to a man here who went to sea from the Brooklyn waterfront when it was a working waterfront. So there is expertise that's been referenced and alluded to. And in my opinion, not just EDC, but many others have had it wrong from the very get-go in the sense that Blue Highway, the real potential there is the longer routes. And the longer routes, Troy, New York, and places along the Hudson and out in Long Island, were they to develop, and the smaller routes in the city would automatically happen. I think you're taking the toughest nut to try to get people to want to move freight from the Bronx to Brooklyn by water. Yes, it's a very congested highway, but it's there. I don't have to pay any more taxes than I already pay to use it. I think it's a tough sell. So I'm not saying that you're doing a bad job. I'm just saying I think that Blue Highway, it's an infant industry. There's a lot of unknowns. To just lump it in as another part of intermodalism and to a consultant who was talking about containerization, it's so fundamentally different. For instance, just for one without getting pedantic, you can't do Blue Highway with a container ship, ever, period. It would always be a roll-on, roll-off ship. Whether it's going to Troy or whether it's going to Queens, roll-on, roll-off is the way to go. And for people in the industry, those kind of things are just so automatic that to think that somebody can be given a very broad brush and said, we're going to look at maritime and you're going to tell us how big the South American container trade might grow. And it is growing, and we know how to measure it. And then we're going to also lump that consultant and tell them, by the way, look at Blue Highway. I think an injustice has been done to an industry that hasn't even been heard from, but it will be heard from.
That's right.
That's
right.
Just to clarify, my response to your question whether Moffett and Nicole also did the Blue Highway study, because you're right, Moffett was about lumping in Moffett and Nicole into the Blue Highway. They didn't do the Blue Highway study. The Blue Highway study has been something we've been working on with DOT for a while. Just earlier this year, EDC issued a Blue Highway action plan. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
I mean, I've seen many of the plans, and I know many of the people, and they're all very good, but they're not maritime people in many cases. They're quick studies.
I would also say that, one of the examples that we've seen that is not roll on roll off is what happens today at the container terminal, which is, as I mentioned, about half of the 6,000 TEU that come in by container ship get put on a barge, and that barge are going forward. And that's a great example of a potential barge-based. I think what we're learning is that the Blue Highway can operate at many different scales. And there's a barge-based scale that is a container-based scale, and then there is a smaller ship scale that's kind of last mile scale. And at the last mile ships, based on one of the lessons that we've learned, I didn't specifically talk about it here, but one of the lessons that we feel that we've learned from this RFEI is that the marginal pier creates a lot of flexibility and opportunity for the Blue Highway users who are operating at the container ship or barge level operations to go at, and the Atlantic Basin, which is protected waters, provides an opportunity for the smaller operators like the 6-boaters and the U.S. Coastal to operate in a way that has a smaller container ships that they're operating. And so I think what we're trying to do is at this point in time, being as robust as possible and kind of trying to figure out how we can accommodate all the different subsectors of this market. And the last thing I want to point out is that while we are very bullish on the Blue Highway, I really think that it is an opportunity, especially here, that the main driver of this plan is the figuring out how to make the container part of the site operate better. If we can also if we can effectuate the Blue Highway, that will only increase and make the container port more effective, more resilient, and more reliable, but it's not dependent on.
I doubt that your logic, because the container port is there. But I would also argue that the resources that are available through EDC has 5 shipyards that are capable of building ships of the small size. I'm not talking little foot ferries. New York City, in its wisdom, thinks it needs to go to Louisiana to buy a foot ferry. We have the capability of building ships in New York State, up to 300 and 400 feet long, steel ships.
I've already got to go over 1,000.
Okay, and I just not, again, not to belabor the point, but I'm the creator of Red Hook Harbor House in Red Hook in 1988. I know it's a long time ago, because I'm an old guy, but what I'm sharing with you and this audience, it's almost pathetic that this underfunded, neglected, beat up on maritime industry is out in front, instead of the policymakers saying, let's at least give them a little more help, and let's get a consultant that comes from their ranks, who knows that this is cold, has only lived it 60 years.
That's
No,
right.
we'll just give it to some other agency in the city, and they'll all read some papers. And I'm not saying they're not smart people, they are, but it's different. Before I shut up, I'd just like to give kudos to New York Coastal Line and Sixborough. And the reason I give them some kudos is because they actually have the right size ship to do the project at scale. Get away from this nonsense of moving a barge from 6 miles along the harbor and thinking you're somehow going to do that competitively. Maybe, if the BQE cantilever collapses, yes, the barge will look very good. But if you want to run it as a business so that it can grow and earn its cost of capital, then you need the right equipment. And the industry, with minuscule resources, underfunded, understaffed, very little, but some political help, has been able to do wonders. And imagine what they would do if they actually had an advocate.
That's right.
That said, we hired Moffett and Nickel because they're container guys, and we put together a consortium of people in the U.S. who have already established efforts to operate. I'm trying here to get rid of all the talking heads because they're everywhere, and get some real people in a room, provide some resources, and see what they would come up with. And I think you'd find out that there would be a companion document to the argument about containerization that would blow your socks off. My parting remark, in its heyday, on the Hudson River, when this is before airplanes, and this is before interstates, so I recognize it's a different time. But there were 31 different companies that operated overnight passenger freight services between New York and Albany, all kicked off by Robert Fulton and the Claremont, which we all learned about in grammar school. And then our teacher moved on to something else. But the reality is that these coastal trades, I think many of us have heard of the Fall River Line, those palatial ships that operated out to Rhode Island along the Sound. What many people don't know is the Fall River Line was one of about 25 companies. So the size of this market is phenomenal, but of course it has to start somewhere. And to be kind of minimalized and marginalized and kind of lumped in with something that is really a different business, because deep sea container shipping and coastal railroad are really separate businesses that share the water. I think that's just unfortunate.
But Jeff, you know why they don't want to do that? Because then they would realize that this doesn't really work as a real estate deal. This would work much more. It would make much more sense than keep it a port. Smakes Madison, one of his articles said that his biggest competitor, this was years ago, is the View. That's his biggest competitor, he said. Not other shipping containers, the View. The Port Authority, when you give that narrative that it's been, that they didn't invest, they were holding on to it because they knew it was worth more as a piece of real estate than it was as a port. But they didn't have the right political people in place. Nydia would never allow this. Nadler would never allow this. Now they have all the players in place. Now they can move on. Real estate plays the long game, and this is where we're at. But in 2018, Cuomo said that the BMT was going to be the next big thing. Then he got derailed. So they've had their eyes. He had just given away our hospital. They had the eyes on the BMT. It's been a long time coming.
So just to respond to one
Jeff.
Just two things about ShipShares. One that is, I want to also make you aware that one of the things that I want to say was about a year and a half, 2 years ago, we issued an RFEI for the highway users to submit proposals to kind of help us learn directly from people who are doing that.
We submitted.
Yeah, you submitted, and we conducted a lot of interviews, and I think that that was an important kind of step in this process for us. And I think that if you want to continue this conversation offline, you want me to connect you with the folks in our office who are working on the line.
I feel you're letting flu. I'm pissed off.
We have 4 papers on our website there, and we're not giving the link, we're giving the paper. So if anybody wants to go to ShipShares.com, you see right there, there's a lead article that says bring back coastal blue highway. And under it, www.ShipShares.com. And ShipShares is 2 things. It's a naval architecture design firm, my undergraduate degree, and it's a ship project capitalization entry. And that's a hard one because maritime does not produce the returns that real estate and black boxes do, but it does produce returns. So we have links to 4 papers that are on that site, right under the picture. So I'm happy to talk to anybody who think I should talk to them. I think those people would do well to know about the literature that's already out there. I hope they do. And it's not people making things up. There have been real people doing this for a long time with their literally both arms and their feet not being on their back. Starting with low box space. For anybody who cares. I just want to say this because I think it's worth knowing. The 5th thing you need is a ship. So anybody who comes to you trying to sell you a ship is saying, you got to give us money. They're already off to a bad start. First you need the shipper. Then you need the docks. Then you need the team. Then you need the capital. Then you need the ship. 5. So you don't start off, I'm not selling you a ship, I'm not selling you a concept. But I am telling you that you've got a guy here, and there's others here too, who have been in the maritime industry their whole careers. And I just feel like, had this process started with what can we do from the maritime lead rather than what we do from the real estate leading, I think we would have made concessions and compromises, but I think it would have been a more balanced development towards the future. And that's what I think has been alluded to. Anybody can talk about container trades, but it's been around since 1956 when Malcolm McLean basically innovated it. And as a matter of record, because again I'm in this industry a long time, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey wrote off Brooklyn 50 years ago. They all live in New Jersey. They all think in terms of New Jersey. Getting them to do anything to the Brooklyn side of the harbor, forget it.
That's because there's no train. There's no way to get the boxes away. The only business the container terminal here has is to move things onto Long Island.
Right.
Or to shunt things further onto the ground. So I think the only way this could really be successful, one is either make the draft companies so that it's accessible to the same ships that can use Newark and only Newark, or Bayonne. Right now, the only ships coming here from the Caribbean are bringing little things, and then large traffic that brings containers in and out, primarily with refrigerated boxes that can't be plugged in Brooklyn because that system doesn't exist. They have to go to ports of New Jersey to get plugged in, to then get parked back at a higher cost to the customer, so that they can be delivered primarily in Brooklyn. I think the largest client of this whole area is community on Atlantic Avenue and surrounding. And then separately, your purple blob, this is confirmed because I've been in the port not too long ago, but also most recent Google images. The dark purple blob extends all the way to storage for containers as well as the forklift used to move the containers on and off. And I forgot what I was talking about.
One thing I want to respond to that was, the the electrification, the refrigerators, the reefers. So there is some capacity for reefers to plug in today. One of the parts of this plan would be the full electrification, which would be,
By the way, there's a capacity to plug in cruise ships at either 12, but they can't do it because the electrical grid workers can't handle it. And they're not there long enough to be able to switch to the shore power and gas.
So let me say that's not actually okay. So let me answer this. We can't part of So there are at any given point in time dozens of reefers that are plugged in at the terminal. There's a capacity there for a couple of dozen of them to plug in electrically, and then we have access to the portion so each of them is part of this plan is to fully electrify the site, which will increase the capacity for reefers, and also the state has contributed about $15 million towards potential cold storage facility on the site, because we've identified issues and ways that should be like just bananas. If you track the way a banana goes from the container ship to your house, it's going back and forth from Brooklyn to New Jersey way too many times in the process. And so part of this is about kind of making that happen more reliable and great in more sense. So what we think is that an important part of this report is to make it all electric, to kind of get rid of all the diesel vehicles that are now, the diesel generators that are augmenting the reefer power, to both increase the ability to plug in those reefers right now, and then potentially add a cold storage facility. We've been looking at one of the things that's been interesting about the potential connection to Hunt's Point, because there's somewhat limited space for large cold storage facilities here. One of the questions we've asked folks is, does it make more sense to build a cold storage facility here or on the Hunt's Point side of it, or a little more space? Because that could be something as well. We recognize the story was told, story that I told many people in terms of explaining why we're doing it. On the cruise terminal side, we're not limited by the grid. We're also not limited by the amount of time we're there. The cruise industry is an important thing. It's not really created a standardized way for plugins. So because of that, when a cruise ship pulls in, you need to align two different things. You need to align where the passengers are board and the board also and we need to align with the quality for the shore power where it's solid. And so unfortunately, there are many of the ships that come in, the way they are aligned doesn't fit the current configuration.
There are, but they stolen power. The average tugboat would probably run 460 hours.
Yeah.
So this is so much.
Yeah, so there's a dedicated substation on site that is just for cruise.
It's not all over the grid. It comes from upstate. It's not from the lower
mentioned that Hunts Point, I think you said 170, Red Hook Marine Terminal employs 200 people at this point. I mean, I speak to them on a regular basis. Hunts Point employs, I think, 2,600 people in the same area, 60 acres. Hunts Point generates about, I think it's $2.1 billion a year. So, I mean, I still strongly think that if we rethink the port, we can make it work without any more housing.
I just had a question on, sorry to ask such a newbie question, because I know you've had so many meetings and lots of communications, which I missed. But is the marine terminal a sort of committed parcel of the whole vision plan now? Has that sort of firmed up where it's going to be the 60 acres, is going to be the marine terminal? I've been sort of confused by some of the flux around the housing.
Let me explain the process. I think you're asking the process. So, when we acquired the site in the summer of 2024, we convened this task force to help us come up with a vision. And that task force spent about a year going back and forth, options, lots of meetings with consultants and agencies, tackling all the various aspects. And ultimately, that task force voted by a two-thirds majority to approve the current vision plan. The current vision plan essentially has three districts. The container port is one district, and there's an area we're calling BMT North, which is the area between the container port and Columbia Heights. So essentially this area, which you'll notice is the portion of the site that's currently out in the East Maritime. I think it's about 15 acres. And that would and that also includes Pier 7, which is converted into permanent. So BMT North District includes about 3,500 housing units, 40% of them will be affordable, and about 18 acres of park space as well. And new roads have a really holding on the floodplain and then on the southern end of the site, around Atlantic Basin, that would be the third district, the Atlantic Basin District. The Atlantic Basin District would include three components. There's about a half a dozen more residential buildings that would be built on areas of current parking lots. The current big 500 car parking lot for the cruise terminal will be turned into junket parking. That would create some opportunities for smaller development. There's about 20 residential units that happen there. Again, 40% of those would be affordable. And then it also involves rebuilds to cruise terminals. So the cruise terminal today is an old 1950s era cargo shed that is kind of reused because it really worked well as a cruise terminal. So the idea is that by give an opportunity for the cruise industry, which is extremely interested in the site. And whenever I go to maritime conferences, that includes cruise operators, I get harassed by the cruise operators who are dying to come in and rebuild the site. So we have, as I mentioned, two of those large operators submitted that as well. So they would rebuild that cruise terminal with a new modern cruise terminal. We also built some attractive park space around the cruise terminal. Right now, that cruise is a one-story, huge, 250,000 square foot warehouse. That would be the new cruise terminal where the state would be about 175,000 square feet in 3 stories. So it would take up a lot less area and it would be a lot better for additional park space. And then the other piece would be some commercial and industrial buildings would be intended for commercial space on the basin to help enliven the basin. And one thing that happens if you're a cruise passenger who comes in at Pier 12, kind of get off the ship and usually look around, right, as a cruise passenger. So we want to do a little some placemaking in this area, which involves some commercial space to make it more lively, and potentially restaurants and shops and things like that. Also about 275,000 square feet of industrial space on that site, with a primary focus on maritime industrial businesses that are going to want to be near the water or near the container port as well. So those are the three districts that are outlined in the vision plan. Process-wise, which is the question was. So process-wise, that vision plan that was approved, that approval was was a really important step for us, but ultimately we'll wait, right? At the end of the day, that was a process that we entered into voluntarily with the local officials in order to come out of that plan with a consensus plan that we would then put forth through the EIS. So the state has a process called the general project plan, which is the way that they entitle property and kind of override zoning and allow you to build some specific things. So the next step is to go through the general project plan process. It starts with this EIS that I mentioned before, the environmental impact statement, and that includes an alternatives analysis. So our vision plan that was approved, that will be the baseline of what we're putting forth. But there are going to be other alternatives that get analyzed as a vision board. At the very least, there'll be a no action alternative. If our plan is determined to have significant adverse impact, so the EIS looks at the potential environmental impacts in like 25, 26 categories, everything from noise, air quality, impact on schools, impact on jobs, traffic, every category you can kind of think of, it analyzes those impacts. And if it determines that there are significant negative impacts that you can't mitigate, such as minor changes to the plan, then we'll have to also include an alternative that is different enough that it doesn't include those impacts. The other opportunity is kind of one of the reasons that we're here today, one of the reasons we've been having this hearing, because there has been some, even though the vision plan was approved by a large majority, there have been some voices in the community that have said that they didn't feel that the vision plan was robust enough and did not market outreach to potential users.
That's me.
That maybe there should be another alternative that explores only doing maritime industrial and doesn't really include the residential component. And so part of that argument requires you to believe that there are maritime users out there who take up, who not only occupy the 1222 campus, but also would have a robust enough economic and financial plan to justify what would still be hundreds of millions, we were talking about before, $700 million just to repair plus, right? So if you're going to invest that much, you won't want to invest that much in the house because, and like you said, it's kind of half used, you want to have a robust site. So part of the reason for this RFEI was to kind of, in addition to the market study that we did to start this whole process, was to do another kind of going back to the business community, maritime business community, and say, hey, is there anyone out there who did get rid of the housing and gave you the opportunity to full site? Do you want the housing? And not to tell the end of the story, but the results of this, and the point of this presentation is a little bit that no one knew that vision came forward as well. That doesn't mean that even the BMTDC or the BMT Task Force Member, the mayor's office of environmental coordination, they could still independently decide we want to study that anyway, even though the RFEI didn't justify it. There was some thought going into this that maybe we'll get responses to this part and then we'll have to, right? That's kind of not what happened here. They can still opt to do it if they want. There's we have this scoping period of comments that are going into March, May 8th, and then once the draft is issued, which I know exactly the time that's going to be, probably toward the end of this calendar year. But once that draft report is issued, there'll be another comment period. So whatever it is they decide in relation to the draft, there'll be an opportunity for feedback and afterwards. So if there are alternatives that people want to be seen that didn't make it into that draft, it's kind of another right of the apple of comments where you can make an argument for why alternatives that didn't get included there are included. And then after that comment period, all those comments will be kind of amalgamated and responded to, and then finally the general project plan will be issued. And that general project plan will be a governing document that we have to enforce the law. So the vision plan we have right now is not a legal document, it's a vision. It is what it's called. But the question you asked is about what's going to be the kind of legally binding thing. So the GPP approval, which is going to happen probably sometime in 2027, if it happens, will be a legal document.
We still got time to stop it. What's the status of the federal grant?
The federal grant, we're still working with federal governments to finalize it.
Now, are you familiar with the truck to barge application? Because I saw it, I posted it online, and on that, the EDC themselves said that the marginal pier was only going to cost $200 million.
So the initial estimate for the marginal pier was about $300 million, and that was much smaller.
The way it should have been. The way it should still be. Well, the one before you decided you're going to use the land for housing, and now we got to move it all the way out to the water. Jim, what do you think about all this, Jim? I gotta go take a shit. There's a lot of bullshit going on here. This man right here was on the task force. He has a viable plan, and it was never even considered.
I'm on the DC now.
What?
And I'm on the DC now.
And now you're on the DC. And
I'm going to be the only maritime person on the DC.
that's ridiculous.
Which is
That's ridiculous.
fucking ridiculous.
But this is not a maritime deal. I feel like they're doing this, and 10 years later, it's going to say maritime didn't work out. And what? Oh my God. Jim, I want to talk to you when